Okay, it's recording.
I'm going to get started. This is indeed a different sort of, going to be a different sort of event today here because our presenter is not present. Unfortunately, we do not know why he's not here. We know that there were some arrests that were made, I believe yesterday, or maybe it was the day before yesterday. I don't know if this involved him directly, indirectly, or whatever, but I suspect that that might have something to do why Steve Horn is not here. Should he show up, we have seating here. We're going to proceed anyway because we have people here that have a direct interest in what we're going to be discussing, which of course is like police spying on American citizens, and there's some people coming in right now, so I don't think that's Steve Horn. Okay. My name is Robert Hughes, and I'm with the Open University of the Left. We are, of course, in Chicago, I'll say that, Left Free Speech Forum. This entity's been in existence for about 25 years. Go back to 1988. Non-sectarian, you know, we are not sitting here proselytizing on any particular radical perspective. We have these meetings and these events where everybody's invited and everybody can come here and utilize the space. And I should add that we are not, of course, tonight or today, this afternoon, at the library, and we have Ayala Laser to thank for allowing us the use of her art gallery here so we could do this program. Thank you, Ayala, very much. The reason for that is that, like, in the summer we have to take a sojourn over there for a couple of months. They have the children's reading program, and obviously our time there will take up their time, so we're out of there for like 7 weeks or so. I will tell you this, we do have dates, and they will be back at the library, and I had them somewhere. I don't know if I have them. No, I don't. We do have a late August date. I think it's the last Saturday in August. Is it the yeah, I think that sounds right. August 24th, that's going to be our next event. I can't tell you who that will be right now because that's not etched in stone. And then in September we have, what would that date be, Peter? Do you know that date? I want to say that's like the third Saturday, probably about September 21st. So those will be the next dates. You have to double check on your calendar, and we'll be sending out a notification on that. I have a sign-in sheet which will go around sometime here, and you'll have an opportunity to if you're not on our listserv, so we can give you, you know, a heads up on what's coming up. You might want to give us your email address, so that's it. Now, I must say that I do not have the names of we have actually got 3 people here today who are going to sort of fill in for our absent presenter. So this should be kind of a free-flow event. But I'm gonna read to you just a blurb for what the title of this was, and I'm sure that the individuals that are here will speak directly to this. But the title of this event was Government Spying, Chicago's NATO 5 and Empire. We live in a world of rapidly shrinking personal privacy while U.S. and global imperialism spreads and consolidates its power abroad. We know about what happened here in Chicago, the arrest in Chicago NATO 5. We have been looking at U.S. government intrusion, spying, and provocation, I'll get that right, as it relates to broader issues. I think what we're going to talk about is, in part, like the interconnectedness between the counterinsurgency efforts that are going on, being conducted by our government overseas, and the same tools that they're using there in other places are being employed here on the home front as well. So at its core, you know, call it COINTELPRO 2.0 and the new, quote, Red Squad in Chicago. We're not talking here about a civil liberties issue, folks, but it's an imperialism issue, and it can't be fully understood or properly analyzed unless we look at it this problem, this larger problem that we're addressing through that type of lens. We're going to also talk here about how the corporate interests and personnel who implement the pacify and control agenda abroad are actually financially profiting from this at home. So in the age of globalization, it makes sense that it all connects, if you will, in this fashion, with the end goals of these implementers, that is of counterinsurgency and call it COINTELPRO 2.0, being really one and the same. So, and then I think to maybe summarize, what hopefully we can do here is to come up with, or at least address some ideas as to how activists can operate in this paradigm that we find ourselves in today. And also maybe discuss some of the shortcomings that we find concerning people's levels. There's just a high level of paranoia as it relates to all of this. So I think, like, without further ado, how we're going to handle this is our presenters here who have just stepped up to the plate in the absence of the speaker that was scheduled to be here are going to be addressing these issues, and we will have them talk for as long as you folks want to speak, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. Okay, so without further ado, take it away.
Yes, thank you for kind of inviting us to come up here and talk about the NATO 5 case and kind of wing it. My name is Jude, and I'll be talking about the cases themselves, and I'll let my co-presenters introduce themselves.
My name is Dylan Northwesty. We're all members of the NATO 5 Defense Committee, and we're strong supporters of the NATO 5, and we follow the cases pretty in-depthly for the past year plus that it's been going on. And so I'm going to kind of talk about the larger forms of privatization that took place leading up to the NATO summit that are directly connected to these cases as a kind of form of crisis propaganda to defend these like major public expenditures being poured into corporate power, as well as the immense surveillance dragnet that was deployed within the activist community in Chicago, and kind of the correlation between those two processes, I guess.
My name is Mary Finn. I'm also a member of the NATO 5 Defense Committee. Primarily, I've been involved for the last about 10 years on anti-war issues. And prior to that, I was very concerned about those issues, but was not actively involved in protesting. I'm going to speak, I think, about government, both local and federal, targeting of particular individuals and or groups.
Okay, to begin with, I wanted to start with a brief description of the different cases. So we're talking about the NATO 5, and it's called NATO 5 because there are 5 defendants, but there are actually 3 different cases going on. And the commonality that ties them together is the use of 2 undercover cops who targeted these activists because of their assumed or alleged politics and political associations. Now, these 2 undercovers infiltrated Occupy Chicago activities as early as March of 2012, and they were getting themselves in there in the lead up to the May Day protests on May 1st, as well as the NATO summit in the middle of May. These 2 undercovers just dressed in irregular clothes and went with stories that they had concocted about how one of them said that he lost his job and was in kind of dire financial straits and was getting involved in Occupy for the first time. Other one talked about how her sister had some mental health issues, which is why she was getting involved with the Woodlawn protests last year. And these different stories that they used to try to create affinity with people and get in on the good side. And they had, unfortunately, a great deal of success in doing so. And what they were able to do as they kind of ingratiated themselves with people in the Occupy and broader activist community here was to start to target people who they thought would be good to set up or get information from or otherwise investigate further to see like if there's anything that they get charged with, which is different than saying they were doing anything that was illegal or could be argued to be illegal, but what could they charge them with? So these two undercovers did a lot of work over a couple months to befriend and then isolate the 5 individuals who became known as NATO 5. I'll talk a little bit about the 2 individuals who are facing charges and then the group that we call NATO 3, which have a very different situation. So one of the activists who was targeted was named Mark Newey, and he was alleged to have solicited materials to create an incendiary device, which is, in his case, was alleged to have been a pipe bomb, from the undercovers. And after that, he was arrested in this very spectacular preemptive arrest before the NATO summit started, where he was coming out of the restaurant and cops swarmed him and hauled him away, like just dragging him off the streets. Very kind of Hollywood-esque snatch and grab style. And he was charged with felonies for solicitation of the materials for an incendiary device. Another activist named Sebastian Snakowitz was also targeted by these undercovers, and he was charged under a relatively new Illinois statute that's basically the state-level counterpart to the USA Patriot Act. And his charges were for falsely making a terrorist threat. Now, this is a very odd legal situation that he was in, because he wasn't charged with making a terrorism threat. He was charged with falsely making a terrorism threat. So another way of saying that was that he was lying or bullshitting or just making stuff up, and that is in fact a terrorism crime, according to the state of Illinois. Both of these 2 defendants were held in Cook County Jail for a number of months before they eventually took non-cooperating plea agreements. As I'm sure you all know, a non-cooperating plea agreement is something that, as a movement for social justice and social change, we definitely value those agreements. So it means that you're not going to snitch on other people within the movement. You're not going to sacrifice that movement for yourself. So these defendants stood strong on that moral principle and refused to give up any information about any other defendants or any other activists in the community. And with that, Sebastian last November took his non-cooperating plea agreement, and he was sentenced to 4 years, which he would have had to serve 100% of that time, so 4 years to the day. But he was able to get into a boot camp, so to serve 4 months in boot camp, at which point he would have executed his sentence entirely and be done with it. Now, another thing with Sebastian is that he is originally was born in Poland, and he had actually been working on getting his permanent residency when he was arrested. And so because of that, as soon as he's done with his boot camp term, which should be this coming Wednesday, he'll immediately be transferred from Cook County's custody into the custody of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and will begin his deportation proceedings to be sent back to Poland. And so his non-cooperating plea agreement was to that false terrorism threat. Now, Mark Newman's situation was different because he was facing the felony solicitation charges, and with his non-cooperating plea deal, he got sentenced to around 3 years. He gets credit for all the time that he served before he took his non-cooperating plea, and he was only has to serve a fraction of that time. And right now, he's in Pontiac prison, and he's pretty isolated. He's far from home, but he has been getting a number of books and letters, and some people have been able to go out and visit as well. So he's serving his time, he's trying to keep his head low, stay out of trouble, and keep a low profile because he doesn't want to get targeted by the other prisoners there or by the guards in the prison because of his politics and because of his charges. But he's definitely in continual need of support. So if you have a moment, you can send him a postcard or a letter or send him some books to help him pass his time and keep his head down. It's always appreciated. The third case is what we call the NATO 3. And these are 3 individuals, Britt Betterly, Brian Jacob Church, and Jared Chase, who all traveled together from Florida to come up to Chicago for the May Day protest and for the NATO summit And they, not all from Florida, but they kind of met there and had become friends like, at that point and came up. And when they arrived in town, they didn't really know. A lot of people were trying to get familiar with the city, get familiar with the activist community, kind of get familiar with like, what was going on, and see like what were the publicly advertised and publicized protests that were happening to like voice dissent with these broader economic policies that Occupy was protesting, as well as the more specific issues of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and all of their abuses and like horrible actions and policies like internationally as well as domestically. Now, these three had the very unfortunate experience of the undercovers identifying them as people who were new to town and didn't really know like who, what was going on, and used that to kind of getting good with them and to start approaching them as friends, as like supposed comrades, so that they could kind of start to isolate these defendants and direct things and shape things like in the ways that they wanted to go, like with like their purposes, the law enforcement purposes of targeting individuals. So what ultimately happened was that the cops set up this really, again, it's a very spectacular, very Hollywood-esque apartment raid where they swarmed this apartment and ended up detaining 11 people and arresting them, taking them down to the precincts. 2 of those 11 happened to be the undercovers, and that was kind of their covers were like so they wouldn't be outed as undercovers or informants, like they're going to get arrested with everybody else. And then these ultimately like 9 people who were arrested were disappeared into like the bowels of the Chicago police precincts, which those of you who are from Chicago know that that's a very broad network with very deep, dark place where they can send people. And they ended up disappearing them for several days as National Lawyers Guild and like affiliated lawyers were busy trying to like find them, trying to figure out like, what was going on. Ultimately, the state had to come out with the fact that they were being charged with several counts, and right now it's like 11 counts, like felony counts that they're facing. The kind of brief summary of them is that they're facing conspiracy charges, conspiracy to commit terrorism, material support for terrorism, and several like arson charges, like solicitation for arson, like attempted arson, that sort of thing. The basic allegations against these 3 is that they constructed and planned to use Molotov cocktails in order to attack various locales. So allegedly different like, police stations and the mayor's house and a couple like other things that in different documents at different times they had just kind of thrown out like lots of different like alleged locations that were under the threat of being attacked. Now, these 3 defendants are also facing charges under the Illinois terrorism statutes, which again are the state level counterpart to the USA Patriot Act. So with the charges that they're facing, it seems that they're the first people in the state to face those particular charges, whereas Sebastian, who is facing the false terrorism threat, seems to have been the second person in the state to have ever faced those charges. Now, what's going on with the NATO 3 is that they're still being held in Cook County, still pending trial. And we just found out on Tuesday of this week that's just passed that the trial is actually going to be pushed back from middle of September of this year to at least middle of March next year. And the defense had to ask for that extension because the state, the prosecutors have been giving every possible document they could think of to give to them as part of evidence against the 3, except for things that are actually useful. So they've been throwing in all kinds of different reports, and they've had thousands of pages of documents all stacked up in here, hundreds of CDs, and hundreds of hours of audio video recordings that they allege is like all this evidence to prove that the NATO 3 are guilty. What we know as part of the defense committee, and I'm sure all of you and all the viewers on YouTube know, is that whatever things that they present that they say is evidence against the NATO 3, like for these terrorism charges, actually just a whole bunch of things that they're fabricating and pulling out of thin air to justify their use of these charges with these really draconian sentences that the defendants should be facing, like put like up to 40 years in prison, in order to target them because of their alleged politics, because of their political affiliations, associations, and because they actually wanted to go out to the streets and exercise their rights and voice dissent to these policies that are hurting not only like people here in Chicago, but people like throughout the world and the world itself. So this campaign against these defendants, although they work in like different ways, are all very much part of a much broader strategy of isolating and targeting particular individuals in order to send a message to everybody that voicing dissent, rebelling, getting out in the streets will not actually be tolerated. It's not actually right that we enjoy in this country, and it will be like harshly punished if you dare to contest the powers that be and dare to voice your dissent. And I'm going to pass it to Dylan and Mary who will talk more about that broader context.
So I wanted to start off with a concept that's been thought about and produced by the thinker Naomi Klein, historian and journalist. It's a concept that she calls the shock approach. I feel like a lot of people are probably familiar with computers online, but let me just lay it out really fast.
Get closer to the mic,
So this concept of the shock doctrine is this idea that there are kind of twin pillars operating at the same time. You have a process of extremely violent state security and creating this like sense of alarm and crisis, the perception of a social crisis amongst large group of people that is incredibly quick and accelerating. And this perception of a social crisis, which is backed up by the intense securitization of the state, militarization of the state, is an impetus towards producing a situation where major corporate power can capitalize on this perception of crisis. So you have the militarization, extreme militarization of the state that creates this sense of alarm. And that sense of social alarm is then seized on as an opportunity by major international businesses scooping up assets being distributed by the state and using this opportunity to enhance their profit share. And this is, Chicago witnessed its own version of the shock doctrine in the lead up and during the NATO summit. And I think it's really important to place these cases of criminalized activists within that context because it helps us understand how important attacking the politics of these activists is to these larger, broader structural processes taking place between the state and the market. So the largest single expenditure, I'm just going to throw this figure out there, the largest single expenditure for the NATO summit for the city of Chicago was $14.6 million in police wages. And what that means is that just within that summit process, where there were 3 or 4 days of the military might of the international empire meeting in the city of Chicago, $14.6 million of public money was distributed eventually to multiple different police agencies. Now, there's a really good professor at the University of Chicago, Bernard Harcourt, who was following the NATO summit at the time. And he wrote an article in The Guardian where he referred to this process as the new form of neoliberal social welfare, right? And this is directly connected to these cases because what happened after the arrests took place in the raid at Bridgeport that you were speaking about is there is this massive production of spectacle in the media that basically presented this incredibly false and vulgar image of these activists as being terrorists and using what they alleged to be their anarchist politics to present them as violent offenders and guilty before they've even been brought into the courtroom. I would kind of direct you to looking at what was released a few days after their arrest, which is called a bail proffer. It's almost like just a press release for the prosecution, but it stood in at the beginning in place of charges. And in this bail proffer, what they use as justification for arresting these activists repeatedly is the fact that they are so-called anarchists, that they are members of the Black Bloc, as if the Black Bloc were not a tactic, but like some sort of organized group with its own ideology, right? And they present this image of these activists as so-called terrorists, while at the same time there's immense amount of money from the municipal government and federal government that's being fueled into private security organizations. So for example, I'm sure everyone's been following the stories about Edward Snowden, and the security contractor that he worked for was Booz Allen Hamilton. Thank you. Booz Allen Hamilton was active in the city of Chicago during the NATO summit. They were a contractor that was working with the city of Chicago to handle security operations. And there were multiple different security organizations that were given what are called no-bid security contracts. What happened in February, before the NATO summit that took place in May, was the city council in Chicago passed a city ordinance that activists in Chicago referred to as the sit down, shut up ordinances. And one of the things that these ordinances did was it allowed the mayor, Rahm Emanuel, to issue no-bid security contracts to whoever he might please that his administration judged to be necessary for the security during the summit. And so there's no accountable oversight for this moving of money into the hands of these private security contractors, while simultaneously there's millions of dollars being moved into so-called public security in the hands of police at the local level, police at the federal level, et cetera, et cetera. And so this process, I think, is really important to understanding why criminalizing the NATO 5, and specifically here the NATO 3, is really essential to this broader project of capitalizing off of the sense of crisis. Without criminalizing these social justice activists, there is no legitimacy for these millions of dollars being poured into these private agencies, as well as being poured into the hands of police who were deployed on the street during the protests. And I think even more so today, as the cases are going on, it really compels us on the left to really provide as much support as possible, not just to confront the overt repression of activists, but also to confront these larger structural economic forms of exploitation. Because obviously in the city of Chicago, we've been faced with extreme forms of austerity, which there are numerous examples that you could look at. And Mayor Rahm Emanuel's government is largely a mayoral government that is driven, and its purpose is to commit these large programs of austerity within the schools, within the mental health facility, public mental health facilities. And these programs of austerity are propped up on the back of these huge programs of handing over public assets to these corporate firms, right? Specifically in this context, corporate security firms. As well as distributing wages to the only public institution that is allowed within a neoliberal government, that being the police. And so looking at these cases now, I think that it's really interesting to note all the different instances within recent status hearings and motion filings and court documents that demonstrate just how ridiculous the spectacle that was put out by the prosecution in the state in the original arrests were during that time, to really drive home how spectacular those claims were. So for instance, within police investigations in the Chicago Police Department, they produce these documents that are called general progress reports. General progress reports are exactly kind of what they sound like. They're reports issued to higher-ups within the police department, basically detailing the progress of the investigation. In a normal police investigation, there are usually about 6 to 8 GPRs produced. But in the discovery process for the NATO 3 cases, they've only given up 2 GPRs for the entire investigation. And the Judge Thaddeus Wilson, who's overseeing the cases right now as they go towards trial, has repeatedly called into question this lack of any sort of accountability or documentation in the investigation, and how suspicious and ridiculous it is that there isn't even these internal documents that are supposed to be tracking supposed investigations. Similarly to that, the defense for the NATO 3 were seeking the cell phones being used by the human surveillance agents that Judith talked about earlier through the undercover police informants. And it was revealed by the police department that these cell phones that the surveillance agents were using to communicate with themselves as well as their supervisors have conveniently disappeared. And so these devices and the records from these devices that would have documented the ideas and thoughts of the undercover agents as they were infiltrating multiple different activist groups have conveniently not been able to be brought out, and they're not going to be provided to the defense to adequately defend their clients. And even in the most recent court date, there was significant debate, and there were motions filed to strike the original grand jury indictment, which the judge, again, repeatedly called woefully inadequate, because there was a complete lack of information. And I think what all these elements show within like more recent court cases is the fact that there is this spectacular accusation that served a particular purpose during the NATO summit, which was to justify the militarization that was taking place on the streets as groups came to participate in political protests. And that extreme militarization, as I was talking about earlier, came at an extreme cost to the public and an extreme profitability to certain private security corporations, as well as a method to release this kind of new form of neoliberal social welfare into the hands of, as I was saying, like the only governmental institution that is allowed within austerity governments, and that is the repression of the police and federal law enforcement agencies. And I think, before I kind of pass it off to Mary Lou, I think what we can look at within this broader shock doctrine process that's really important to people who are trying to organize resistance to austerity and injustices, structural injustices in our society, is that it really kind of compels us to be very serious about things like security culture, especially as like political movements take place that are much more decentralized than they've been throughout our history. Speaking as someone who was originally involved in Occupy Chicago for several months, it was definitely a process by which kind of what Jude was describing, where there was a lot of trust that was shared by people who really didn't know each other very well at all. And I think that those things need to be taken into account as those of us who are more actively organizing to educate people about certain practices of security culture so they're aware of what not to say to criminalize yourself, if someone might be an informant, what to look out for certain signs of people who might be dangerous in this respect. And I think it's increasingly important in these political mobilizations that are taking place within the United States but across the world, where there's just regular folk are being drawn into the streets to resist austerity and militarization and the repression of governments. It really compels us to be out there. We are actively organizing and say to people and to regular folk who are just coming out to dissent that you have to be aware that the police will use these tactics of infiltration and surveillance on a human level, and that you need to be aware of the ways that you can resist that. So kind of with those broad strokes of talking about the shock doctrine and the importance of security culture within Chicago in relation to the NATO 3 cases, I'm going to pass it over to Mary Lou for this final segment.
Okay, I'm going to just give you some information about myself. Back in the 70s, during the Fred Hampton, Mark Clark, well, after they were assassinated by the Chicago Police Department with the help of the FBI, there was a civil trial brought by the survivors of that attack on the house on the west side, plus the family members of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. And I attended, that trial went on for many months. I've never really checked the newspaper to see how long it went on, but it was a civil trial where the survivors and family members were suing the city of Chicago, the Cook County State's Attorney, Edward Hanahan's office, and I'm not sure what other organizations for money because of these killings of their family members. So that was, since that time, I've always had an interest in what I call political trials. I've attended some others when the FALN, the Puerto Rican independence movement, when they were when they were arrested, I think, in a van in Evanston, and several of them were tried in Chicago. I attended, just at that time I was working full-time, and I couldn't really attend the trials. But over a period of time, I have attended trials, and I got interested in the NATO 5 as part of that. I also attended some trials back probably in the 90s and early 2000s, where there were, one was of two Palestinians, another one was of a Syrian American who had a charity in Bosnia. And so there was a focus on Arabs, on Muslims, but Arab Muslims and their charities. So that's just kind of a little bit of background about me. I want to say that the NATO 5 trial, the NATO 3, these trials are not occurring in a vacuum. The U.S. government has been targeting certain individuals and groups for probably at least close to a century, and probably much longer than that. Back in the 20s and 30s, it was anarchists and communists. In the 60s, it was black liberation movements, primarily the Black Panthers, but other, certainly Malcolm X, so other black liberation movements. Also anti-war activists. In the 90s, it seemed to be more Muslims and their charities. And after 2001, the September attacks in 2001, it was Muslims from, I'm not sure how many countries, 20, 30, 40 different countries, who were all Muslim males, probably between the ages of about 16, and I don't know whether it was age 40 or 50, and this I haven't really researched again, but from about 20 to 40 or 50 different countries had to go in and be interviewed, and I don't really remember which federal agency interviewed all of them. Some of them who were here undocumented left the country. I live in a neighborhood where I live not too far from Devon Avenue, so there are a lot of, particularly Pakistanis now, in that neighborhood, and I've heard from a few people that a lot of people left the country. A lot of Pakistanis who were not here, you know, with proper documentation, they just left. More recently, the federal and local law enforcement have focused on environmentalists, particular environmentalists, more activists in their tactics, animal rights activists, anti-war, international solidarity. We had a case here in Chicago that is still ongoing in September of 2010. I believe it was 14 activists in Chicago, and more of them were in Minneapolis. 11 in Minneapolis, and 3 in Chicago were served with grand jury subpoenas, and several of their homes were raided and much of their possessions were taken. That is still an ongoing investigation. One of the people in Chicago, a Palestinian American, his possessions have not been returned to him. And after September, from October to December, another 9, mainly Palestine solidarity activists in Chicago were also served with federal grand jury subpoenas. They all refused to testify, and that's the status of the case right now, although the last check was that these cases were still ongoing. Some people, some activists have talked in terms of there being 3 steps in what the federal and local officials are doing. First, there is the step of targeting individuals or more likely groups. The second thing is the second step is infiltration, and the third step is entrapment. you know, the question arises a lot of times is why don't these defendants use an entrapment defense, that they have been entrapped. From my understanding, there has never been a successful defense on using the entrapment defense. So that usually has not been used. But the Cleveland 4 or originally 5, there was entrapment there, and one could surmise that there has been an entrapment in the NATO, with the NATO 5. I've attended many of the court hearings, which now are scheduled on an every 2-week basis. They're on Tuesday afternoon, scheduled at 2 o'clock in room 303 at the Criminal Courts Building on 26th in California. I find that from attending these court hearings, I continue to be educated politically about, very different from what I learned in my history books when I was in high school and college. But some of the things that the judge has said, which don't make it into any reports from either in the mainstream media or in alternative media, but the judge seems to make these asides, criticizing the state kind of in an indirect way, the Cook County State's attorney. I mean, he's talked in the past about giving the defense more leeway in cross-examination because of the quality or substance of the state's evidence. On Tuesday, he specifically said that the state's case seemed to be weak with regard to a particular issue. I'm sorry, I haven't had time to review my notes because I wasn't expecting to do this. I was expecting to listen to someone who has written about the NATO 5 case in the alternative media. So if any of you are interested in attending court hearings, it's a way to offer solidarity to these activists. I certainly feel that our law enforcement people should not be spending time infiltrating activist groups. And I guess the other thing I want to bring up, the issues that I am most concerned about have to do with U.S. interventions basically all over the world. I am interested in how these policies affect us domestically, but I am more concerned. I mean, my primary concern is about what we are doing to poorer, browner, blacker peoples in this world outside of the United States. I lived for a couple of years in South Asia, and I think this is probably why my focus is there. And right now, particularly with regard to Pakistan and Afghanistan. And it was really the lead up to the war on Iraq that got me politically active. As I said, I have always had an interest, even as a child. My father was, had political connections with the Democratic Party, but I've always had sort of an interest in political issues, but I did it from a distance by reading, voting in particular ways or not voting in particular ways, but it was really the lead up to the Iraq War that got me politically active, and I've continued that. In fact, I have felt that if I didn't do it, I would be less mentally healthy than I am right now. So I think unless Dylan or Jude have something that they want to add, I think we'd like to open it up to questions. I'm sure there are issues around this issue that Steve Horn might have touched on that we have not, or things that you were expecting to hear about that one of the three of us has not talked about, and we will try to answer those questions.
I will add really fast that if people are interested in committing to working on more support work with the NATO 5. We have a really good website that's up. It's, if you just Google NATO 5 WordPress, it'll come up. And they always need donations for their legal defense. The People's Law Office and the National Lawyers Guild are defending them pro bono, but in any criminal case, especially with one with such like magnitude and media attention like this, there's lots of costs associated with just going to trial. So they need any financial support that anyone here or any of the viewers online can provide, as well as books. They're at Cook County Jail right now, which means you don't have to send books from the publisher like you would if they were at a prison. However, they have to be paperback. And they also enjoy correspondence from supporters to let people know that there are people out there that recognize the complete ridiculousness of these charges and support them politically. So if you check out that website, there are opportunities to do all those things, as well as informational material and tons of research and stuff that you can look at to learn about the cases. So I would just promote that resource if people are interested in finding out more and contributing.
Thanks very much, guys. We're going to have an open mic now, so we're going to, everybody can get up here and make a comment, ask a question, whatever. We would ask you to please hold on your comments. I mean, we don't need to hear your magnum opus here. We all know we've got plenty of things to say, but that's in consideration of others to give everybody a chance. I guess we have maybe an hour or so. I don't know if we'll get that far, but to take questions. I just wanted to, make a comment, ask a question, I guess. I'm thinking about listening to the three of you talk here, and the thing that just keeps coming back to me in all of this is that, I think to the extent that the public has got any consciousness whatsoever going on here, it's probably limited to the notion that we're talking about a civil liberties type issue, if that's, my concern is, and I'm hearing it from you as speakers, that, there's a broader, much broader thing. Not that civil liberties aren't important, but there's a broader question that's really present here, and that is to say that, this is, what we're witnessing here is merely the domestic illustration, if you will, of a much larger problem that's going on in this country, i.e., militarism. And, there was if you ever there's a website, blackagendareport.com, and I just saw this morning. I had this thing up before I came over here this afternoon, and there's a picture of Obama, and it's a parody on the Lone Ranger, current movie that's out on screen called The Drone Ranger, with him, with the mask on, now bombing everywhere. So, I think that succinctly kind of describes all. Anyway, I'd like your ideas on, there's a couple of things that we're dealing with here, I think, is on one level, it's fear, call it paranoia, but how we can perhaps work around this to better organize. There's a lot of people out there, I think, right now that are probably more aware than ever as to what's going on in this country. I guess the question is, how do we organize that and, move forward in a positive direction I know this is a broad topic, but, what can we do, to try to turn this around, before it gets even worse? Because, I think we're on the cusp of things that are a lot darker than what we've even seen up to now going forward. I'll leave it at that.
I guess I would just kind of emphasize something that I said earlier, is that I think that, I would just personally say that, not speaking from the Defense Committee, but just speaking as myself, as a person who experienced Occupy Chicago, that, I think in the lead up to the summit, a lot of us who were organizing marches or just active in Occupy Chicago did not have a strong awareness of, really promoting education education about security culture and letting people know that there are serious risks that you're faced by the repression of the state merely by choosing to protest and choosing to critique these, awful forms of oppression that we've all been talking about. And I would say, in hindsight being 2020, but in retrospect, I think one thing that we could have done that is like a lesson for people who were organizing at that time, and I think that we can take from it, is like taking the time to promote these ideas of security culture and its importance, and being aware that infiltration, that like Mary Lou was talking about, is a really dominant tactic and technique that is utilized, especially today, with much more like grassroots uprisings, I guess. So I do think that as far as just like a kind of immediate like organizing technique that we can adopt for ourselves, like I think that's really, really important. I don't know if anyone else wanted to throw in anything.
Well, really quickly, I'd add that as the person was saying, there's so much going on, and there's so much that we kind of look around us and see like all these things that are terrible and like more terrible. And the reality is that we have to do something about this, and we have to do so urgently. We have to do so now. And in order to like affect any kind of change, in order to shift the direction things are going and the conditions, material conditions that we're experiencing now and that people in the future generations will be experiencing, requires us to use that diversity of tactics to do so. And so there will be people out there who are doing things that we may not agree with, and maybe for a reason we don't agree with, but we need to see the commonalities and the parts of the struggles that we share and support each other unconditionally as people are taking action of various sorts and struggle against these like systems of oppression, like forces of oppression, and stand in solidarity with people who become targeted by the state for whatever reasons, whatever the actions were or were alleged to have been. And that's the one of the things that we're doing as the NATO 5 Defense Committee is promoting the solidarity for the defendants. Because the issue is not about what they were alleged to have done or not. The issue is about imperialist forces that are selecting individuals to target to like tell us all that we shouldn't resist and tell us all that the cost of any kind of dissent is too high of a price to pay. Other questions? Sorry.
And by the way, the microphone, if you want.
Yes.
I want to thank our three panelists, not that this is over in any way, for stepping in at the last minute, volunteering to help rescue this event. Everyone knows I love to lecture and testify. I'm going to try and not yield to temptation as best I can. One of the things I'm grateful for in my life is that I've had the capacity to keep learning after my education, which only ended, undergraduate education only ended in 1997. I was lucky enough to study under Bill Pelz, who some of you know. I studied history. And he said very succinctly that after World War II, the United States actually had a real easy time pushing the Russians around, because the Russians were really poor. They just didn't have any money. They had their influence since World War II, and an important one. But the Soviets were very poor and easy to push around. This is a revelation to me, believe it or not, at that late age. And I want to say that only recently I've come to realize something that should be obvious to other people who read history, which is that the Cold War was not about the destruction of Russia. The Cold War was actually an effort to keep things rolling in terms of capitalism, exploitation, and militarism abroad at home. If we didn't have the Russians, we would have to have created them, which we did in the form of Muslim terrorism after Russia went away. The lessons of 1984 being very important. And I just wanted to point out and ask the three of you to expand upon. I would want to thank you for your very specific and on-the-ground information and analysis that you gave. But I wonder if each three of you would revisit as best you can and expand upon the degree to which the connection, and this is something Steve Horn had mentioned in his introduction, is the connection between this repression at home and what the United States does internationally abroad. The United States and the rest of global financial capitalism in terms of exploitation and militarism. And I had one more thing. Oh yeah, before 2000, right after 2008 and before, there was talk on the left about trying, in terms of speaking to ordinary folk who may not be terribly political, the rather obvious trying to connect the cutting of domestic spending and what became the austerity at home to the wars abroad, and trying to make that connection. But I wonder if you do your best, and again in a conceptual way, because that's what I like to hear, about how this war at home that you've been describing, the war on civil liberties and the war on dissent, has a connection to what goes on abroad. And I want to thank you again for mentioning Naomi Klein's shock doctrine. I think it's rather, I'll stop with this last piece of testimony, but it's rather obvious to me when you mention media spectacle, the degree to which media spectacle is crucial, whether it's international media spectacle or local media spectacle, or not even news at all, just bullshit about celebrities and crap like that, in order to keep people distracted from what an unbelievably lousy deal and what theft is going on in terms of the political economy at home. So if you could each speak about the connection between the war at home, the war on dissent that you've been describing at home, and the international rape and plunder of the rest of the planet. As you've already done some of it, I'd be really grateful. Thank you.
Why don't you? Okay, I never cease to be amazed how people that I think are good people, I'm talking about family members, friends, people who spent the same time that I did in South Asia with me back right after college. I was in the Peace Corps in India, in a small town, along with other high school teachers and nurses. So we were all college educated. Anyways, I never cease to be amazed how these people who I know well, continue to know, there's going to be a reunion in a couple of months, don't seem to have the same concerns I have. I can't figure it out. It really is very discouraging to me, personally, very depressing to me. And as I said before, if I were not active, I think that I would, my mental health would be in a much worse state than it actually is in right now. It's not in a good state, but it would be in a much worse state. I don't understand how people can know, what we did in Vietnam. We have no idea how many millions of Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians we killed. We have no idea. I remember reading something by Noam Chomsky that, it could be 2 million, it could be 3 million, it could be 5 million. In other words, the figure is not just 100,000 one way or the other, but it's 1 million or more one way or the other. I'm old enough to have been somewhat active against the war on Vietnam. But we've done this in many other countries, certainly Iraq and what has happened there. And there are enough news items in the mainstream media for Americans to, if they are open to hearing those things, which for one reason or another, people are not open. I personally think that we all grow up in this country with a myth about this country, that this country has had good intentions, that we, our interventions are to bring democracy and freedom all over the world. And I think that at least I needed to go through a very long process, which took decades, to give up that myth, which I think has contributed to my depressive symptoms when they occur. And I think that most people are not willing to go through that process. I mean, I was much older than Dylan is before I started this. Well, maybe not that much older. I was in my late 20s when the process started for me. But because I was not active with any group, I kind of did it on my own, just by reading and seeking out certain events to go to. And I didn't become active, as I said, until about 10 years ago. When I was in my late 50s, early 60s. My primary concern is really the U.S. war machine, and I also saw that article about the drone ranger. I thought it was very funny. By Glenn Ford, he and the other Glenn Greenwald are two of my favorite authors, along with Naomi Klein, and there are a couple of others, but I don't think Glenn Ford or Glenn Greenwald could write something that I wouldn't totally agree with. I don't think I've answered the question. I've more talked about myself, but basically I don't have an answer to how to get more people in the U.S. to be concerned about what we're doing. I mean, I don't think it's possible. And I'm basically not in this to see change. I'm in this to save myself. I'm very unhappy with the U.S. I have another option. I have a citizenship elsewhere, and I can't get myself moving to put that into effect. It's a country that I guess it's somewhat part of NATO, but they're not invading other countries. Sorry, I don't even remember what the question was. Right now I'm focusing on myself. Sorry about that.
I'll respond to the question that you asked. I guess I'll start off by saying, I think actually we need to be careful about kind of lumping together the kind of state repression based on politics that took place in the Cold War and the process that takes place in the War on Terror. Specifically because I think that the ideological concept of terrorism in our society, especially after September 11th, is so extremely flexible and such an abstraction to such an extreme degree that it accomplishes such a decontextualization from particular circumstances that it can be deployed within specific circumstances to such an extreme degree. So if you look at the cases, the case of the NATO 3 specifically, the People's Law Office filed a motion to challenge the constitutionality of the Illinois state terrorism law. And if you read that statute, the terrorism statute, the way that they define terrorism is so non-specific and abstract that it essentially allows it to be deployed into a completely heterogeneous, otherwise combination of different contexts. Whether that be what is obviously much more predominant in our society and internationally being black and brown Muslims, it can also be directed like what we're seeing in people who are alleged anarchists, or it can be deployed to animal rights activists, deployed in such a broad variety of contexts. And I think that that's really significant to understanding the condition of global militarism as it relates to this particular case. In a certain way, the way that the ideological concept of terrorism functions is it really parallels, in some senses, the commodity relationship, and that it is this this abstraction from a context that allows for this continued function of oppression and it does so in a way that like radically like homogenizes all these different situations and makes like the perception of them on this level of like spectacular crisis without, and it creates this like false consistency. And so I think that that's really important to understanding, I guess, the condition of militarization globally as it relates to sustaining a neoliberal economy of austerity and the centralization of wealth, is that it accomplishes a kind of abstraction that, you know, me speaking as a younger person, but that I don't recognize as clearly as in the era of the Cold War as being such an extreme abstraction to parallel the abstraction of the commodity relationship, I guess, the way that I compared it. And I think that that's really important to understanding what we're struggling against as far as the cases of the NATO 3, is that this is a particular deployment of this like legal ideological concept of terrorism in a way to basically like scoop up activists and place them within this like assumed consistency of like spectacular violence. And so I guess, I don't know if that answered your question in any way, but I think that that's definitely worth considering. And I would advise people actually to check out our website and really take a look at the PLO's motion filing against the state terrorism statute, as well as the judge's response to the state terrorism statute, because they're both very important documents, I think, to understanding the way that the sort of cultural and the governmental relationship to this war on terror and this concept of terrorism and how it's being incorporated into all these new different fronts of oppressing activists and sustaining this kind of cultural militarization.
Just a couple of observations. First of all, I'd like to reiterate, I don't feel shortchanged by you being on this panel, so thanks very much for stepping in. Just a couple of points to make. Firstly, I think because I'm an alien, I'm more acutely aware of the fact that, for example, I don't have the rights that citizens have, although, as we've seen over the years, that even those rights can be easily suspended or taken away in the name of the war on terror. So, but I'm always like that, and it's a shame because I have a history of activism, and that has limited the extent to which I feel able to be active. It limits it, it doesn't stop it. But I must say, as somebody who was at the march, the anti-NATO march, I really became aware of this idea of the militarization of the police. I mean, what was most shocking to me, I think, apart from the huge numbers of police there, was this business with the armbands, where they had the barcodes on the armbands so that they could more quickly process people that were arrested. So you just have to, like, go into a supermarket, you can just, scan the policeman and all the policewomen, and all their details will presumably go into the documentation. But I think it's something that maybe people became more aware of when they went on this march, because there were a lot of people there. But yes, I think, there are people, I'm trying to remember the name of that guy, the law professor who wrote that book on enemy aliens, David somebody, I can't remember, but I have the book, where he discusses the history in America going back over 100 years of, both turning, foreigners who are resident in America into these alien creatures, but also turning citizens into aliens as well, and usually for economic benefits of various people there. So more comments and questions, but I think it's something, this whole militarization, and also the incorporation of, if you like, private paramilitary organizations. I think I briefly saw something about Wisconsin being defended by these masked guards. There's a site there that's been the site of protests where you've got the old Pinkertons type people coming back in.
On that issue, I think it's important to recognize that summits such as NATO or the Democratic National Convention, the Republican National Convention, like other things that the state would amass a lot of police and a lot of times National Guard and different sheriff's offices and whatnot. There's a few different things that happen there. Pretty much as a matter of course at this point, those things will be designated national special security events. so like NSSEs. And that allows for different operations to happen and also for different types of coordination, such as joint terrorism task forces and fusion centers to kind of like amass all this data and be like a central staging area for all those militarized police operations. And those things also include a lot of training and resource sharing from different jurisdictions across the country to prepare those different local police departments and sheriff's offices to conduct these operations for like the so-called like, security at protests and whatnot. And that cross-pollinization and helps to standardize policing practices across the nation, which has been something that's become like more and more true over the last 50 or 60 years. There's a really excellent book called Our Enemies in Blue by Christian Williams that documents the evolution of policing in the United States from kind of early like slave patrols and kind of town security systems into disparate police departments and whatnot, and then to much more like congealed and much more systematized and standardized methods of policing. So I recommend that resource. But one thing that is pretty much like always true about these different times, like when the police are being like militarized like this, is that those training protocols and like those practices and also like the resources that come from these mass like police mobilizations are retained by the local police departments and they are routinely used. And they're routinely used like on the populations that the police are controlling like to begin with. And that usage is not strictly a matter of like pulling out so-called like non-lethal or like less lethal weapons such as rubber bullets and tasers and like that sort of thing. When there's like some kind of protest or like something happening like in the streets, but they're used as a matter of course on populations that have historically been targeted by the police, particularly like poor and people of color communities. And so some reasons to contest like these practices that you're mentioning is that it's not only that they use it against us in the streets, like when we like choose to go out there, they use it on people like who are like walking down the street, going to and from their houses, going to their jobs, going to their store, as a matter of course, like through like the racist, repressive policy system that exists here in the United States. So there's lots of like interweaving and interconnected reasons why we need to contest policy practices that further militarize the police and like further allow them to use these tactics against us in like whatever, regardless of what the context is.
Yeah, I'll just, as a piece of information, I'll add to that. In Chicago, like, the school closings were going on recently, and they were closing, eventually it was 59 elementary schools. There was serious concerns about safety for students, and the Chicago Police Department routinely mentioned that they were going to use the NATO security protocol as like to protect students as they were closing down the schools. So it's just like a local example of what she was talking about.
I just want to mention that this morning my wife gave me an article in the Law Journal. It had a lot of coverage, something I haven't seen over the years, of militarization, dealing with the legality of this as far as in violation of the Third Amendment. So I've never seen anything like this before in a Law Journal publication. It's actually devoted somewhere around like 7 or 8 pages of describing the militarization of our police force, which is a very serious issue. One of the things that I was aware of that there are on the order of 100 SWAT team militarized armored break-ins into houses. Residences are broken in 100 times per day in this country, which I had no idea that that number was that high. They're actually coming in, battering the door down, coming in armed and with their guns out. So this is something that's happening all the time. Now that's something that is being trained for when these soldiers go into Afghanistan and Iraq, where they really have no respect for citizens because they're military. They're allowed to kill on some kind of suspicion. One of the things that bothers me so much is that we have these people that are trained in military operations coming back and getting jobs in law enforcement domestically. I was in the Air Force in the early 70s, and talking to pilots, they talked about when they were leaving that they couldn't get jobs with domestic airlines because of their military record, that they were thought to have a certain disregard for protocol, for safety, and they were not allowed by their temperament to go and transition directly into flying airlines. There was a recognition that a military psychology mentality is very different than what is acceptable in a civilian environment. So it's to me it's very interesting that today there's no differentiation between military police. Police today wear all the armored. They come trained to strike first, to shoot first. And I've seen articles where people come and knock the door, and we had the one recently where the person was being interrogated, and the person was being interrogated by the FBI, where the person was shot 10 times, 1 time was in the head, and I just had to wonder, was that person shot in the head first and then 9 times elsewhere, or were they shot in the body 9 times in the head? No matter how you look at it, it's excessive. And if people come from a military expedition to Afghanistan where the lives of people are not considered to be significant, that's a horror in itself. But that when we bring this horror back home as a police force, I find extremely objectionable.
That was the Boston bombing suspect.
Boston bombers. That's
It
correct.
was in Florida. He was a friend of one of the two sergeants.
He was executed.
Right. Anyway, I just had to add that. I don't know if there's any. I just wanted to bring in the militarization. Maybe Doug will be responsible. But thank you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, really, thank you guys for stepping up. This has been a really stimulating conversation. And
Could you talk into the mic more? Thank you.
I said, thank you guys for stepping up. This has been a really stimulating conversation. I appreciate it, and I'm sure we all do. I just want to say a couple things. Now, I like Naomi Klein's analysis, and I like what she's doing, but I think, as the gentleman mentioned, the Cold War was a slow-burning fuse, and it did the same thing. It allowed the capitalization of something that was public domain and privatization of the means of force. And we have another slow-burning fuse in this country that allows the same thing, and it creates a privatized public space, which is the prison-industrial complex. We're turning public safety into private profit, and we're giving up community security for corrections. And my experience is that the progressive left has a lot of trouble getting their heads around this. And let me tell you the palpable sense I get. My wife is an organizer, and a lot of what she does brings people from the suburbs into the movement. And many times I've heard people say, I get it, it's the corporations. And they've never thought about that before. And it's bringing people in, and they sense the kind of depression we're talking about now as a whole new thing and as a new threat. And they're feeling like they're on the cutting edge of being repressed. But when you step back and look at the war on drugs and the prison industrial complex, this has been going on for a long time, and it penetrates our communities very deeply, and it destroys our communities. And it is another slow-burning fuse. Now, I was down in Inglewood this morning, and we're talking to a group about stuff to do. And we want to know what we should be doing. What are the action steps? They're tied into whole groups of people that are on parole. They're training them, and they're working with them. And we're talking about how do we mobilize these folks to join the movement. I'm up here with my wife. Everybody's white. I'm down there with the prison industrial complex people. I'm the white person in the room, usually. And these groups need to get together. We need action steps that tie the prison industrial complex repression with what we are experiencing as a new thing. And it's not going to work unless we do this. And the most disappointing thing that's happened as we've worked on this is, you know, I went to Madison for the unions. I do a lot of things that I would say support the unions. But the unions really resisted us in closing the prisons here in Illinois. And we need public education. We need to know that these people aren't careers. They're people. They should not be in prison. And we need to shut this thing down. We need to stop that repression and stop this new repression we have going on too.
Yeah, I just found out just last night that the people who are resisting organizing against the fracking, they have been referred to Homeland Security as terrorists. And I think that they are pushing it too far. The backlash will come sooner or later. This is going too far.
Okay. I wonder what damage will be done though before the backlash comes.
Yeah, but it will come.
Again, thank you for stepping in and being under fire here too, having to answer questions. First of all, with just a note, you call it militarism of the police. I wonder what is it that it's not the police itself, is whoever us who enable the acting out of police of their own problems on those that are under their mercy. I used to work in a psychiatric hospital as a psychologist for many years on a forensic unit. So they came from criminal court. And most of them, of course, were black and young males. And for example, this one guy was committed to a mental health psychiatric outpatient. He was released. He didn't commit a crime. But, you know, he was waiting at the hospital for the psychiatric help. They wanted to force medication on him. He was not going to take it, but he was there for a while. He was waiting like for 2 hours, and then he got pissed off. I probably would have gotten pissed off after 10 minutes. So he got up and to leave toward the door. He didn't have a gun or anything. He was shot by police 32 times. He looked like a column there. He survived, but he weighed much less than he did before. You know, again, I think the issue is how to mobilize, how to organize, how to wake people up. I think when I speak with people, a lot of people understand that we have to reframe words like representation, you know, those that are supposed to represent us, who really do not represent the nation. When we say this is the national interest or the national security, what do we really mean? Whose security? The corporations, the power structure, or the people? Nationalism has to be reframed again. What is the interest of the nation? Who is the nation? And most people do understand that our representatives, so-called, do not represent us, that nationalism really is protecting the regime, the power structure, rather than the good of the people. And yet, will not get their ass up to the street, to organize, and that is still, I don't know that you can answer that, okay? I don't know what is the answer. Is there some anesthetic in the water? But how to do that? I'm so happy. If anybody has an idea, I think this is it.
I don't know, I see the photographs of the masses of people, you know, in Istanbul, in Brazil, in Greece previously. And I myself also wonder what will get people in the U.S. out in the streets. I have no idea what it is.
Our feeling.
The draft.
The draft.
They don't need the draft anymore. I guess I saw, I think in the Tribune last night about some plane that was pilotless that landed on an aircraft carrier. So they, you know, they don't have to worry about body bags coming back to the U.S. anymore, or certainly not in the numbers that they did just, you know, 5-10 years ago.
Okay, so is that it? Going once?
I just wanted to
To the
mention-
microphone.
It's not really about this conversation, but I just wanted to mention I've been handing around some leaflets about an event here tomorrow at 3, where we're going to be having a discussion about the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and you know, this is actually changing. It's changed a lot since we originally thought about having this meeting. So we'll also be updating, talking about the events in Turkey and the newest events in Egypt. And then we're going to follow that by a party for Bastille Day, so there will be food and drink as well. So this is at 3 o'clock in this very space, so I would invite you all to come here and have some...
Tomorrow?
Tomorrow, yes. Yep. So, if you're interested,
Are you going to be the speaker?
yes, or somebody very close to me, whose name isn't quite the same.
Helen, it's a woman.
Pardon? Yes, it is me. Yeah.
Let's see.
Well, I guess since
And Peter Hudis is also speaking.
No, I know.
looks like we've pretty much exhausted the question, I'm just going to make a comment here. I think we'll call this a day. You know what is missing in all of this, I believe? I mean, if we can look to history, I think, and there's a lot to be learned there. And basically, social change, and maybe I should preface this by saying that, like, part of the problem is living in a culture like this, and I've heard allusions to this in part of this discussion today, is we are so atomized. I mean, we all kind of live in our own little, you know, you turn on the computer in the morning and you decide to read that website like Black Agenda Report, and, which, I mean, believe me, I'm all for it, but as if that's actually doing something. You know, a couple of, what was it, about a month or two ago, we had probably one of the premier, if I can use that term, activists in Chicago, contemporaneously speaking, Andy Thayer, you know, and he made the reference to, like, what we gotta get here is like boots in the street. I mean, the bottom line is, until we've created a movement, i.e. that means not thousands, but literally millions of people, and I think we are, quite honestly, a long, long way from that moment, but that's what it's going to take. I mean, you're going to have to shut the machine down. If you can't do that, it's not going to change. It's incapable of reform. This is my little spiel. You know, going out there once every 2 or every 4 years and taking one from column A and one from column B and pulling the lever, like that makes a difference, forget about it. You know, that's what they want you to think. And you see the net result. Because, right, democracy. you see the results, you know? I mean, we're like slowly sliding into fascism. You know, let's call it what it is. I don't know what it's going to take, you know? It's as bad as it's ever been. I mean, nobody in this room was here, you know, back in the McCarthy era. We know all about the oppressions that transpired. We can go back to like right at the end of the First World War, the Palmer raids. Remember the Palmer was, I don't know if anybody knows about the Palmer raids. This guy was an attorney general of the United States, and they deported, I don't know how many people were in prison. They deported 10,000 people that didn't have citizenship, primarily individuals that had been members of the communist or different political movements at that time, anarchists, socialists in general, IWW. They couldn't deport them, most of them were Native Americans, but some of them went to jail. Big Bill Hill was executed. The point is in all this, though, that this is what it's going to take. I mean, we've been very atomized. We've got many groups. Everybody's pursuing their own little agenda, and there's nothing wrong with that. But somehow, some way, this whole thing has to coalesce into something larger than anything we've seen so far, if there's ever to be any real change at all. And on that note, I want to thank you guys. I mean, you really picked up the ball here. I might add that this is the first event we've done, I don't know, what, several years, where a presenter did not appear. And I think we more than rescued it. You more than rescued it. So let's give ourselves all a hand. Thank you very much.